Good morning, everyone, and Stuart Tov. I hope you had an enjoyable Shabbos. Last week, we commemorated Yom HaShoah and had the opportunity to hear from two of our dear members who are survivors, Jack Joseph and Rose Ramarovsky. A truly engaging and interesting presentation we had. And this morning, we have the opportunity to hear from Stuart Eizenstat, a U.S. diplomat with many years of experience, as well as an attorney. And he has spent a considerable amount of time and effort on the subject of Holocaust restitution, which is the topic this morning, Holocaust justice, remembrance, present, and future. And this morning's program was very kindly arranged by Charles Bornstein, a member of our synagogue. I'd like to thank Charles for all his efforts for the shul. Quite frequently, he offers initiatives and programs. He puts a lot of time into it. He's dedicated and he cares about the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. He is well esteemed by many of our members, and we want to thank him publicly for his friendship and his support all these years. Charles will formally introduce this morning's program, so please give your attention to Charles.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jacob Gold. And of course, Stuart Eizenstat, who is our guest this morning. I think that everyone will be seeing a little bit more of the rabbi and Rachel, who's the chief operating officer of the synagogue. And Stuart will be available for some questions after his much anticipated speech. I'm really honored to introduce this morning's guest in the form of Stuart Eizenstat, ambassador to the European Union under the within the Clinton administration. He's an American statesman and an equally significant statesman for Jewish causes worldwide, which is very rare. He will address some aspects of his seminal work to recover the cumulative stolen but not lost fortunes of the European Jews. The Elie Wiesel Award will be conferred virtually on Ambassador Eizenstat this Thursday from Washington. Information regarding the presentation is available on the museum website. Established in 2011, it is the highest honor of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Elie Wiesel, the museum's founding chairman, was the award's first recipient, subsequently named in his honor. That is why it is fitting and proper that we have Ambassador Eizenstat speak this morning from the platform of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, Elie Wiesel's spiritual home. As White House Domestic Affairs Chief to President Carter, Ambassador Eizenstat gave birth to the very idea of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in a memorandum to President Carter. He then played the pivotal role in establishing the President's Commission on the Holocaust, where Eizenstat recommended Elie Wiesel as chair and started the legislation that led to the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His relentless efforts to obtain compensation and restitution for Holocaust victims and non-Jewish forced laborers, particularly from Eastern Europe, elicited praise from all of Washington's political spectrum. He was perfect to lead the charge, pairing governmental experience with a growing international legal prowess. Wiesel states, quote, he fought with skill, tenacity, and devotion for the needy survivors and prevailed. In the Clinton administration, as I earlier said, he served as ambassador to the European Union, also serving as the president's special representative on Holocaust-era issues, and during the Obama administration as special advisor to the Secretary of State. Ambassador Eizenstat served for more than a decade as lead negotiator for the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, with the German government securing increased benefits for survivors, including survivors from behind the Iron Curtain. He continued to serve as expert advisor on the Holocaust-era issues in the Trump administration and retains the same position presently within the Biden administration. Elie Wiesel states in the introduction to Stuart's book, Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II, that the book is really not about money. In a deeper sense, it's about something infinitely more important and more meaningful. It's about the ethical value and the weight of memory. The duty to remember covers not only big accounts, huge palaces, and rare art collections, but also in the less wealthy families. The enemy deprived them of their pathetically poor possessions. In other words, the poor were robbed of their poverty, an extraordinary thought. What remains is their memory. It too silently permeates Eisenstat's story. Eisenstadt's story. I've been saying Eizenstat, I should stay with it. It was Eisenstadt's book, President Carter, the White House Years. I think you can, initially familiarized me with Stuart. I also used this book as a reference for my Fifth Avenue Synagogue lecture on the Camp David Accords. So when FAS member Judy Rubenstein, you know her, the little lady with the red hair, I mean with the flaming red hair, spoke to Sid Gold, the Broadway producer and agent, about my play, Sid recommended sending it to Stuart Eizenstat in Washington, which I did. I then received a jubilant email back, just one word, great, followed by an invitation in Washington to lunch. Unfortunately, the shelter-in-place order was given within days, so this is the first time I am meeting him too, although we have talked and corresponded often. Elie Wiesel was multifaceted. When he chanted Torah, he always made phrases. So when he came to the end of a musical paragraph, he intuitively tapered off or got softer. So starting nowhere and ending nowhere, which is the definition of a musical phrase, which he had intuitively. Again, a profound lesson, not only for cantors, but for musicians as well. Engraved on the award are the words from Wiesel's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, "One person of integrity can make a difference." Stuart here is that example. I have a picture now I'd like you to see of Stuart. Do we have the picture up?
Yes, let me get it, Charles.
It's of Stuart's 1979 Seder, in which President Carter and his family were the guests. You have that picture? I think it's in Stuart's book here. I could probably.
Let's see. Well, I
get the
have it on my
page.
screen. I'm just, let's see.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, you can see on the left, Stuart behind and between President and Mrs. Carter and the family. In not attending the Seder, I was deprived of not opening the door for the spirit of Elijah. So it's poetic justice here that I'm opening the door for Elijah Eliyahu Wiesel through the presence of His Excellency, the Honorable Stuart Eizenstat. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm deeply grateful to you as a dear friend and congregant of this wonderful synagogue of making it possible for me to address all of you. I want to thank Rabbi Babbage, your president, Jacob Gold, and Rachel Arkengold, your COO, for their support. And another connection that I have to the Fifth Avenue Synagogue is your marvelous cousin, Joseph Malavani, who I've known for years and who's been good enough to grace my home with some of his recordings. I'm speaking to you in the month of April, which has been a momentous month just after Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, all coming almost back to back. Yom HaShoah is a poignant reminder of the worst tragedy in modern Jewish history, in which we lost 2/3 of European Jewry, the center of Jewish culture, scholarship, and religion, 1/3 of the total Jewish population. In 1939, before the outbreak of World War II, there were 17 million Jews in a world of 2 billion. Today, in 2021, there are only 14.7 million Jews in a world of 7 billion. Israel's Memorial Day reminds us of the sacrifices of Israel's soldiers in defending the state of Israel from its enemies. And Israel's Independence Day both underscores how the absence of a Jewish state during the war, to which European Jews might have been able to take refuge, contributed to the Shoah, but it's also a symbol of the resilience, vibrancy, and continuity of Jewish people. Think how fortunate we are to live at a time of the rebirth of a Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile. Israel's withstood constant wars, has become a refuge of Jews from Arab states, Ethiopia, and the former Soviet Union, and now a world center of 21st century technology. Today, there are roughly 330,000 Holocaust survivors worldwide, 40,000 in New York, and we must honor their courage in building a new life, creating families, giving us all inspiration, arising out of the ashes of the Holocaust. There was nothing inevitable about the Holocaust, nor is there anything inevitable about the genocides in the world today. They occur when human brutality is left unchecked by people of goodwill and when governments turn their backs on genocide if it doesn't directly affect them. The Shoah is a tragic example of what happens when people are indifferent in the face of evil, when neighbor turned on neighbor because of their religion, and when the United States and the Western world refused to act significantly because of prevailing anti-Semitism. A poll in November 1938, shortly before the outbreak of World War II, found that over 70% of Americans were against allowing German Jewish refugees to come to the United States for safety, although over 90% opposed Hitler's treatment of Jews. In effect, Jews were expendable then, just as other religious and ethnic minorities are expendable today. It's important to remember that Hitler's initial goal was simply to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews, and he proceeded methodically, waiting to judge German and world reaction, and then seeing none, took one step after another. He got a clear signal and said so publicly that the world did not care about protecting Jews and that he had a free hand to commit the worst genocide in world history. At the 1938 Avion Conference in France, called by President Roosevelt to deal with the plight of German Jewish refugees, the United States representative failed to take the lead in lifting our rigid immigration quotas as an example to the rest of the world, while at the very same time, the State Department did everything it could to restrict Jewish immigration. Tragically, there were 1 million unused visa slots, and Hitler boasted that the world cared nothing about the Jews. In May 1939, the SS St. Louis carried over 900 German Jewish refugees and sought for days outside of Miami, not being allowed to land, nor welcome in Halifax, Canada. No U.S. economic sanctions were imposed by the Roosevelt administration on Germany before we entered the war. The fact is, we now know President Roosevelt had substantial evidence about the growing dimensions of the genocide of the Jews, but failed to act, including a personal visit by the courageous Polish diplomat Jan Karski, who I met in his later years, who gave President Roosevelt and Justice Frankfurter his personal account of the brutality of the Warsaw Ghetto. Arthur Hayes Salzberger, publisher of your New York Times, gave his editors instructions to bury stories of the Holocaust, concerned his paper would be seen as a Jewish newspaper. And frankly, nor did Jewish leaders in the United States do all they should have to pressure FDR to act more urgently on behalf of Europe's beleaguered Jews, likewise afraid of raising anti-Semitic sentiments. In the immediate post-war days, the atrocities hidden from the rest of the world were revealed with the liberation of the death camps, and to his enduring credit, filmed at the insistence of Supreme Allied Commander, later President Dwight Eisenhower. While Americans were shocked by these newsreels, the staggering dimensions of the Holocaust were not understood, and it quickly took a back seat as the focus of the United States and the West was in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. There was little demand for justice beyond the Nuremberg trials of only a tiny fraction of Nazi perpetrators, and Jewish survivors were often poorly treated. Those coming back from the death camps and from hiding and from ghettos to reclaim their confiscated homes in Poland and Lithuania were driven away and in some instances actually killed. And post-war Western property restitution laws in Europe were unsatisfactory. Survivors lived in squalid displaced persons camps after the war, so wretched that President Truman's personal representative reported to him, and I quote, "We treat the Jews like the Germans, except we don't exterminate them." Great Britain kept 52,000 survivors trying to reach Palestine in camps in Cyprus, some up to 5 years. Survivors rarely told their stories because they wanted to shield their children from the horrors through which they had gone and wanted to focus on building a new life. And authors like Elie Wiesel had difficulty finding publishers for their books, like Ellie's classic book, Night. But the monstrous dimensions of the Holocaust could not be hidden forever, although action to deal with its consequences was slow and painful. Another April landmark, almost exactly 60 years ago, put the Holocaust before the world. The 1961 trial, beginning April 11th, 1961, in Jerusalem, broadcast by television worldwide of Adolf Eichmann, following his dramatic capture by Israeli agents in his hiding in Argentina, putting a human face to the slaughter of which he was a central actor. My personal relationship with the Holocaust, because I never met a survivor, it was never discussed in my house, I never had a course on it in high school or college, came in 1968 when a colleague of mine in the Hubert Humphrey presidential campaign against Richard Nixon, Arthur Morse, had just written a path-breaking book called While 6 Million Died, which shockingly described what President Roosevelt and his administration knew about the genocide of the Jews and failed to act on it. And I literally said to myself, I was 25 years old at the time, if I ever had a chance to remove this cloud from the history of the United States, which had done so much through its military to win the war, but so little to help the Jews, that I wanted to do so. That book broke a dam of silence, and a whole genre of other books followed by major historians. Wider audiences were belatedly introduced through documentaries and films, like Claude Lanzmann's classic 9-hour Shoah, an NBC TV miniseries in 1978 called The Holocaust, Sophie's Choice with Meryl Streep, and Steven Spielberg's classic Schindler's List. At last, the Holocaust seemed firmly embedded in the public consciousness, but now it's slipping away over the decades. The Holocaust created, for the first time in history of warfare, a legal process by which a country defeated in war, which had been abusing and murdering civilians, both its own citizens and those of the countries it occupied, agreed to compensate individual survivors, never done before or since. In September 1951, the first post-war German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, accepted responsibility for, and I quote, the unspeakable crimes that have been committed in the name of the German people, end quote. A month after Adenauer's historic speech, Dr. Nachum Goldman, president of the World Jewish Congress, convened a meeting in your city of 23 major Jewish organizations, and speaking for the collective Jewish world, created the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, or the Claims Conference, with the approval of the young state of Israel, to negotiate with Germany on behalf of Holocaust survivors. In Luxembourg in 1952, the Jewish Claims Conference and the West German government signed protocols along with the Israeli government, under which Germany would compensate Holocaust survivors directly and through the Claims Conference. And to this day, and to its great credit, Germany has provided over $80 billion for Holocaust survivors. More on that shortly. The history of the Claims Conference negotiations with Germany over these decades has been to expand dramatically the number of survivors eligible for payment as we tracked Germany's post-war history, a history of which post-war Germany can be proud, including covering for the first time survivors and their property in the former East Germany and former East Bloc following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1990. Since 2009, when I began to lead the Claims Conference negotiations with a worldwide team of survivors, including my co-chair, Roman Kent of New York City, who just had his 96th birthday yesterday, we've negotiated an additional $9 billion from Germany, monthly pensions, hardship payments, a new child survivor payment, payments to those who were on the kinder transport, a supplemental payment just last year and this year for the poorest survivors, and particularly home care and medical and food services, so we can keep aging survivors in their homes. I can assure you, in the former Soviet Union, you wouldn't want your worst enemy to go into an old age home. We've expanded that from 34 million euros in 2009 when I started to 544 million today, almost $600 million. All these programs go to survivors in economic need. Just a few weeks ago, we obtained agreement from the German government for $13 million for a vaccine program for poor elderly Holocaust survivors, especially vulnerable to COVID-19, and who lack access in the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe to facilities where they can receive shots. And yet, with all of this, today, April 2021, of the 300,000 Holocaust survivors around the world, at least 50% are poor or near poor. 90% of those in the former Soviet Union. 35% in the Jewish state of Israel. And 30% in the United States. And in your city, the richest city in the world, 40% of New York City's 40,000 survivors live in or near poverty.
Not anymore.
More than half of the survivors receive some form of payment from the German government. A second unique feature in international law occurred during the Clinton administration. Payment by private companies for the harm they caused to civilians during World War II. Because the Holocaust was not only the greatest genocide in history, It was the greatest theft in history, only a small fraction of which has been recovered. I was the lead negotiator as special representative of President Clinton and Secretary of State Albright on Holocaust issues during that administration. We reached agreements totaling over $8 billion with Swiss and French banks, which had hidden for 50 years Jewish accounts created by Jews to protect their assets as they fled the Nazis. German and Austrian companies which employed slave labor. European insurance companies which refused to pay the families of victims, often saying they didn't pay their premiums when they were in concentration camps. The return or compensation of Nazi confiscated Jewish private and communal property, synagogues, cemeteries, day schools, community centers, to help the shattered Jewish communities after the Cold War, which emerged from the twin tragedies of Nazism and communism to rebuild a new and vibrant Jewish life. In 1998, I negotiated with over 40 countries the Washington Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art, establishing principles for the identification, publication, claims, and return of some of the 600,000 artworks stolen by the Nazis. These Washington principles were broadened in 2009 when I negotiated the 47-nation Terezin Declaration in the Obama administration. And although these are not legally binding, their moral force has profoundly changed the art world. 5 countries, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, and the United Kingdom, have established claims commissions to adjudicate claims against public museums which hold these looted artworks. Thousands of paintings have been restituted or compensated due to these principles. The 2 major art auction houses, including Sotheby's and Christie's in your city, have created full-time staffs to assure that they do not sell or auction Nazi looted artworks, and Christie's has resolved over 100 cases. In 2018, the U.S. Congress passed the JUST Act, calling on the State Department to report on the implementation of the Terezin Declaration by its 47 nation signatories, and I assisted in that being done in August of 2020. But monetary compensation and restitution should not be the last word on the Holocaust, nor are they the only ways to deal with violations of human rights and genocide. One way was shown by Nelson Mandela, creating a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. But apologies are also important as a healing. In 1988, the U.S. Congress finally provided compensation for Japanese Americans who survived the detention camps on the West Coast, and President Reagan issued an apology along with it. In 2018, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau apologized for his country turning away the SS St. Louis. No American president has done so. Holocaust education is now more critical than ever as eyewitnesses dwindle, not just to look back, but to learn the lessons for the future to deal with our contemporary challenges. In a recent survey, almost half of American millennials and Generation Z, the youngest, could not name a single ghetto or concentration camp. 56% could not identify Auschwitz. 63% didn't know 6 million Jews were killed. And roughly half said they had seen Holocaust denial or distortion posted on their social media platforms. And yet there is progress. In January of 2000, I worked with the Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson, to establish the Holocaust Education Task Force to promote worldwide Jewish education, then with only a handful of countries, but today that's now become the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance with over 30 countries. And yet in the United States, although we initiated this with the Swedes, only 17 of our 50 states mandate Holocaust education. Last year, 2020, Congress passed the Never Again Holocaust Education Act to provide $10 million to promote Holocaust education through grants to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And last year, in our negotiations with the German government, we made a huge breakthrough, not just in more money for survivors, although that's critical, but for the first time, Germany will pay for worldwide Holocaust education up to 18 million euros, that's about $25 million, by 2023. Has the Holocaust taught the world anything? Have we learned anything? At one level, one can say we're simply repeating the mistakes of the Holocaust with continued acts of genocide around the world. But I believe that the world is slowly developing the international instruments that at least have the possibility of incorporating the lessons of the Holocaust if combined with the leadership of the United States and other democracies. Prior to World War II, individuals had no rights under international law. But in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted a resolution still remaining a landmark today, creating those types of rights and leading to other international agreements such as the Genocide Convention. The Council of Europe, after the Holocaust and clearly as a result, adopted the European Convention on Human Rights and established the first organization allowing individuals to sue states which violate their rights, the European Court of Human Rights, which remains active to this day. The International Court of Justice in The Hague was created to be the principal civil court of the United Nations, and international criminal law and institutions have evolved to deal with violations of human rights. This, of course, began with the Nuremberg Tribunal to try Nazi war criminals, but in 1993, the UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Soviet Yugoslavia and several of the worst Serbian human rights offenders who created what was called ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo were tried and convicted. In 1994, the International Criminal Court of Rwanda was established following the Rwandan genocide. And in 2002, the International Criminal Court came into being, to which over 120 nations, not including the United States, are members. And since then, over 40 leaders, including Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, have been indicted by that court. Today, there are many human rights groups that didn't exist during the Holocaust to shine a bright light on human rights violations. And the Holocaust Memorial Museum's Center for the Prevention of Genocide, to which I belong, researches and works with members of our government to highlight areas where genocide is occurring or at risk. The internet and digital communications, cable television, and aggressive journalists bring war crimes and acts of genocide directly in our homes to stir our conscience. Nothing was like that during the Holocaust. For sure, the limitations of international law are all too painful. We have to depend on the goodwill and leadership of Western countries, and particularly the United States, and particularly the President of the United States. I'm confident that under the leadership of President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken, whose stepfather, Sam Pizar, was a Holocaust survivor, will make the United States again a beacon of human rights. And did indeed, Secretary Blinken recently called China's treatment of its Uyghur minority genocide. Each of us has a responsibility. We should pledge ourselves and urge our governments to remember the lessons of the Holocaust, to take effective action against hate directed at anyone or any group at home based on race or religion, ethnic origin, or sexual preference, and find ways to speak out loudly against human rights violations and genocide abroad wherever they occur and against whomever it is perpetrated. That indeed would be the best legacy to remember the 6 million who were killed and those survivors who are still with us. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Charles, thank you also for bringing Ambassador Eizenstat to Fifth Avenue Synagogue. What a privilege, and your introduction was absolutely beautiful, very poetic. Ambassador, thank you not only for your very fascinating and informative remarks, but also your decades-long dedication to pursuing justice for those affected by the Holocaust. I know that some members of our audience do have questions, and you can submit any questions you have either through the chat or the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen, and then I'll be happy to share those with the ambassador. So I was curious what percentage of survivors you think have received some kind of restitution?
So today, about half of survivors are getting restitution for many of the payments that were made earlier when there were more survivors. As many as 525,000 did. But I think today, roughly half of survivors are getting some payment from the German government and through other of the programs that we've negotiated.
And how does
and again, and Rachel, it's important again to realize these are largely income-based. They're not going to someone who's made millions, although frankly, they suffered as well. It's heavily income-based.
And how does the process work? Does the survivor need to file a claim, or does the German government go through lists of survivors from the camps or Kindertransport?
So that's a very good question. The Jewish Claims Conference has an extremely large and accurate database of survivors by categories. For example, how many months were they in ghettos and concentration camps to qualify? And the German government honors but audits the Claims Conference's database. Anyone who believes that they are eligible or should be eligible and hasn't gotten payment certainly can contact the Claims Conference or me directly, and I'll make sure the Claims Conference gets you. But there really is a very orderly process. Checks go out very promptly and are provided to anyone who meets the definitions that we've defined with the Germans.
So one of the points that was raised by one of our synagogue members, Dr. Oscar Weg, whose own mother was a Holocaust survivor, is that other governments, specifically he mentioned the Polish government, were just as cruel in their treatment of the Jews. And he was asking what can be done for Polish victims of the Holocaust who lost lives and property. And I was wondering if any other governments share the financial responsibility for restitution, or if the German government is alone in providing the funds for this.
So that's a very good question. First, Germany, obviously, as the perpetrator, has done the most, and they paid $80 billion, as I mentioned, since 1952. With respect to Poland in particular, it's a very mixed picture and in some respects very disappointing. With respect to private property, and 40% of pre-war Warsaw with buildings and homes was owned by Jews. Private property is something I've worked on unsuccessfully for over 25 years. With communal property, particularly synagogues, the Polish government has returned hundreds of synagogues, often, of course, in disrepair. And Poland has done one positive thing, and that is, along with Austria, they have created, and this is really important and not well known, they have created a monthly pension for any Polish Holocaust survivors, regardless of where they live today, if they were in Poland during any part of the war, equal to the amount they pay their regular senior citizens through their Social Security system. Austria has done the same thing. But getting private property back is extremely difficult. We have suggested a sort of mass payment where, as we did in Austria, we set a cap. In Austria, it was $210 million. And we allow claims to be made at a substantially reduced fair market value today to provide at least some compensation, but it simply has not worked. There really is growing anti-Semitism in Poland. It's a very, very conservative government, and it's very, very difficult and very confounding to try to work with.
Speaking of private property, I know that you've been very involved specifically with the return of stolen artwork. And I was wondering maybe if you could just spend a minute to tell us a little bit about that process. I know you were involved with the return of Gustav Klimt's Lady in Gold, and talk a little bit about the evidence that's required, what burden, again, is on the victim of the theft to prove that it was stolen, and how that process has worked.
Thank you. That's one of the things actually that I'm most pleased about, although there's still so much work to be done. Let me start with the problem. There were, as I mentioned, 600,000 artworks and millions more of books that were stolen. Hitler fancied himself an art collector. He was going to build a museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria, with the most prized possessions. And in my book, Imperfect Justice, I have actually a photo of General Eisenhower in the Merker salt mine, where some of the looted artwork was stashed. At the very last weeks of the war, a group called the Monuments Men were created and embedded into the U.S. Army. These were art historians and experts who risked their lives to collect, and did, over 100,000 paintings, and took them to collection points in Germany after the war. They cataloged them and then sent them back to the countries from whom they had been stolen, but not to the individuals, because at that point it was very difficult to find who the individuals were. And those countries, Rachel, were supposed to create their own claims processes, and they did not. It was a very imperfect process. And so that's why in 1998, through our Washington principles, we created this voluntary process. So there are now mechanisms where you can claim your art in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Germany, in France, in the UK, and those are voluntary, but basically established principles. You do your provenance research. And in Germany, as a result of a negotiation I've very recently done, Germany is putting another 4 million euros, about $6 million, to pay its public museums to research what's called the provenance of their art collection. And that's what Christie's and Sotheby's do. Any piece of art that goes through Sotheby's or Christie's for auction or sale, they have full-time staffs that vet whether they pass through European hands between 33 and 45, and if so, if they had some unusual provenance. The Met has returned some, the National Gallery in Atlanta and Washington has done so. The Germans have returned hundreds, and the Austrians thousands of these paintings.
Thank you. So you alluded to switching directions a little bit. You alluded to the anti-Semitism in the Polish government, and I was wondering if we could talk a little bit. I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the anti-Semitism in Europe. Just this week, we saw the atrocious ruling related to the murder of Sarah Halimi. 70 years after the Holocaust, could you talk a little bit about the persistence of anti-Semitism in Europe on the back of the Halimi case? Should Jews in Europe feel safe? Can they feel protected by the system of laws and justice there? Or is this simply another reason that Jews should flee Europe?
Well, I certainly wouldn't suggest that Jews flee Europe, having been ambassador there and spent large amounts of time in Europe. But first, let's talk about anti-Semitism in the United States, because the Anti-Defamation League has cataloged dramatic increases in anti-Semitic crimes and other hate crimes in the United States over the last several years. Now, let's take Europe. I was quite recently, before COVID, in the summer of 2019 in Paris, and I met with the leaders of the French Jewish community. And there, the anti-Semitism is largely Muslim-based, and is very, very significant. So, for example, believe it or not, their major organization called the CRIF, just like RUJA, is actually quietly relocating Jews from villages and places where they would be unsafe to more safe places in Paris. The modern Orthodox executive director of the CRIF, who wears a kippah, told me that he would not wear a kippah in certain areas in Paris. So there is a significant problem. Now, the French government has really reacted, I think, positively and been helpful. In places like Poland, you have Holocaust denial. I recently had an event with Anne Applebaum, who's published a book on growing authoritarianism. And she talked about how now she's been blamed, and she's married to a Polish politician, for being Jewish. I mean, attacks there. So it's happening in Hungary with Orban. It's a very, very serious problem.
Mhm.
And the United States does have a special envoy on anti-Semitism worldwide to try to intervene in these situations and raise public consciousness against them. But it is amazing. Here we are 70 years after the war, and we still have prevailing anti-Semitism in a number of countries.
Mhm. When you were ambassador to the EU, did you feel that lingering anti-Semitism then, or do you think there's just been a spike in recent years based on immigration patterns that you mentioned?
I did not feel it
Mm.
at all. I was there from 93 to 96. I traveled widely, not only then, but throughout the whole Clinton administration and afterward in Europe. I think this is a phenomenon that has spiked in the last 10 years or so with the growth of Muslim immigration and with the growth of the far right, both in the United States and in Germany and in Hungary and many other countries in Europe.
Yeah,
And France itself.
very tricky problem, because when it's something I guess we could anticipate happening more and more in the United States if immigration patterns similar to Europe are established here or left unchecked. And yet when you try to create limits like that, then the people creating the limits are accused of racism. So it's a little bit of a problem.
Well, it's also it is really also a phenomenon, Rachel, of social media. Social media has given platforms to extremist groups to spread lies and distortion. And this is a real problem. Twitter and Facebook are belatedly beginning to create blocks on some of the anti-hate postings and at least markings to check some of the distortions. But the internet clearly is a mechanism, as we saw in our own country with some of the, January 6th attack on the Capitol, where some people were wearing 6 million wasn't enough, or Camp Auschwitz.
Mhm. Well, that's actually a good segue to another question I had, which was about Holocaust revisionism and denial, and whether you thought those were organized efforts, perhaps being propagated through social media, whether it's from Iran or other sources, and what you might recommend that we could do about it.
Well, some of it is organized, some of it is simply spread by lies that then metastasize through similar websites of people who rely on these far right extremist groups and individuals. The question of what to do with it, first, as I mentioned, it is to make sure that Facebook and Google and YouTube and all of our social media, Twitter, do not permit those distortions and hate speech to be on their platforms.
Mhm.
Number two, as I mentioned, just in the United States, only 17 of our 50 states have any mandatory Holocaust education. And in that study, it's very interesting that over 80% of the young people who were polled said while they had very little knowledge, they wanted to have knowledge. They wanted to have mandatory Holocaust education. So that's certainly a very major part of it. The ignorance is just staggering. And the education, again, should not only be looking back, it's learning lessons
Yes.
from what happened.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. So one of the major achievements that you have accomplished is, of course, the establishment of the United States Holocaust Museum, which is such a powerful vehicle for educating people from not just our country, but around the world about the Holocaust. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the establishment of the Holocaust Museum, whether you had particular allies who helped you. Were there opponents to your efforts? Were there any factions who were against the creation of the museum, or were you simply able to move forward as you garnered support?
That's a very good question. So this happened when I was President Carter's Chief Domestic Policy Advisor in the White House, and my aide and staff member, Ellen Goldstein, had just read an article by William Safire, the columnist for the New York Times, just before the Skokie neo-Nazi march. And he said in his column, it is as if the United States and Americans don't know anything about the final solution. And she sent me a memo and said, maybe we should do something about this. That then activated me to write a memorandum to the president in April 25th, 1978, to create this commission. It was announced by the president on May 1, 1978, with Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, on Israel's 30th anniversary. And Begin had many members of his family lost during the Holocaust as well. Now, in terms of opposition, it wasn't so much there was opposition, but there were many who said it shouldn't be in Washington. Put it in New York, where most Jews live. And I think rightly, Elie Wiesel and the commission felt, no, this needs to be an American museum to the Holocaust, not just a Jewish museum. And since 1993, when the doors were first opened, and I was there at the opening ceremony with President Clinton and Elie Wiesel, remarkably, almost 50 million people have visited the museum. It's the second most visited museum in Washington. And of those, Rachel, we estimate that over 90% are non-Jews.
Oh, amazing.
And I love to see the young school kids coming in from the Midwest. I love to see the officers, police officers coming for tolerance treatment, and midshipmen from our Naval Academy and the Air Force cadets and West Point cadets coming through. People from all over the world. It's become a sort of obligatory stop for world leaders. It's a tremendous educative device. And the Genocide Committee of the museum makes sure that we point forward as well. I was there very recently to tape an interview for the award I'm getting that Charles was nice enough to mention, the Elie Wiesel Award, on April 22nd. And one of the exhibits that they have, of course, the museum is closed because of COVID, but it will be reopened, is about the genocide of the Rohingyas in Myanmar, to show the world that this is not just a past event. We have to use the lessons to deal with current genocides as well. And that's what's made, I think, the museum so relevant today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we can start to wrap up as we get close to noon. This was just a fascinating program. Charles, I don't know if you would like to say anything in conclusion, or Ambassador. This was just an amazing program. We thank you so very much.
No, like everyone, can you hear me? Am
Yes.
I a speaker?
Yes.
Like everyone, I'm grateful for Stuart. I'm not being casual. As you know, Stuart tells everyone to call him Stu upon a first meeting. So not being disrespectful, in other words. I would like to say something. I'm very unhappy about the way President Carter is regarded in Jewish circles, because it's not deserved. And it's bothered me enormously from my colleagues and fellow Jewish people. When you research what President Carter had really done for the Jewish people, it was the first time in 2,000 years that the Jews had protection in a treaty worldwide, starting with Egypt, and followed with others. And this was so important. And no other president has touched this Jewish-Israeli issue. Everyone was scared of it. They helped Nixon. Everyone helped a little bit, but they stayed clear of it. He was the first one to really jump in. And no matter what he had said or title of a book here or there, the fact is he was the first one to take the power of the United States and create a safe homeland for the Jewish people.
But let
I'm
me
sorry
mention-
if
thank you,
this
Charles. I mean,
offends
I think
anyone.
that people remember his Apartheid book, but look, beside the peace treaty and the creation of the Holocaust Museum, he championed Soviet Jewry. And Natan Sharansky, who was the leading refusenik and was falsely charged with being an American spy, during his trial, Avital, his wife, appealed to me and I to the president. The president made a public statement, which presidents never do, that he was not an American spy. And Natan said that saved his life. But let me show Rachel and Charles one relevant factor for me and the president during the administration where my recognition of the Holocaust and its lessons helped. I got a call after the hostage crisis from Sam Kermanian, a young Iranian Jew in the United States. There were 100,000 Iranians then in the United States, business people and so forth. And he said, the president has just issued an executive order to expel all Iranians in the United States after our hostages were taken. That will be a death sentence to us. Our leader, El Haghani, has just been assassinated and his body has been dragged through Tehran. So to make a very long and interesting story short, which I have in my book on President Carter, I created an interagency effort. We exempted all Iranian Jews and Baha'is and Christians in the United States from being expelled. And we got 50,000 Iranian Jews out of Iran. We did exactly the opposite of what happened in the Holocaust, where the State Department said, and Tony Blinken said this with a cable from the State Department, which said, delay, 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 when German and other Jews were trying to come in. We gave the opposite. We said any Iranian Jew or Baha'i or Christian who wants to come in to the United States should be given an immediate visa on humanitarian grounds. And I've been twice honored by Iranian Jews in Los Angeles, where a large percentage went. It's a wonderful story of applying the lessons of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Because I remembered what happened when our consulates shut their doors and wouldn't let Jews who were trying to come to the United States come in.
Well, thank you so much. What an inspiring way to end the program. And we just, as a community, thank you for the work you've done to save lives, as the story you just mentioned illustrates, and also the work you've done to elevate the memory of those who perished. And we pray that in the merit of what you have done, that the neshama of each Jew who perished in the Holocaust has an aliyah and shemayim. We thank you so very much for your lifelong work, for pursuing justice for all those affected by the Nazi murderers and criminals. And we thank you very much for joining our community today.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Charles.
And we look
Thank you,
forward
sir.
to seeing you at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. We hope you'll visit us soon.
Thank you very much.
Good day.